And a bottle lasts a long time.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and get started, and the rest of them have to catch up with us because we've got a lot of
This is a long
stuff
one.
to cover tonight. So, more than I thought there would be when I got into this. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, again, as we open your word and we partake of what you have for us there, I pray you will anoint your word as it goes forth. Anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have me to say. And anoint our hearts to receive, that we get that portion you have for each one of us. And I thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we're going to continue looking at the book of Esther. And we got some background about King Azarias and what he did, his ascension to the throne, a little bit about what it was like in the times of the Persian Empire. And we're going to continue some of that because we'll pick up some even, I think, more particular insights into some of this. It'll help us understand Scripture maybe a little bit more. And even as we read in some of the other Old Testament and New Testament books, to understand a little more about what court life is like, because basically they were all pretty much the same. The Persians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and even the Hebrews under the kings had all very similar customs when it came to the royal courts. So this will kind of give us, I think, a little better feel for how some of this stuff played out in those days. So let's start with Esther chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Azarias subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be brought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparation be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So let's look at this process of selecting the next king. Queen, queen. So it was sometime after the feast that we looked at last week, especially after the one given to those living in the castle, that Hazard remembered his actions. Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of think about this as being not long after. In other words, about the time he sobered up. I don't think there was a great amount of time left here. He had to wait for his mind to clear up. Now, when you think about it, he'd been drinking. Everybody else was coming and going into these feasts, especially for the 6-month period. But he had to be there for all of them. Notice I emphasize had to be for all of them. So he was taking in, no doubt, a great amount of wine over the 6-month period, plus the additional 7 days with his servants and so forth. So he'd been on quite a drinking binge, just to be honest about what was going on here. So it probably took him a while for his mind to finally clear up and for him to come back to consciousness. And it was then that he remembered Vashti and what had happened. It's interesting that there is no indication of any remorse on his part. He remembered, and he didn't say, "Oh, what did I do?" Vashti is beautiful, and look what I did. I don't think he had the capability of remorse. There are some people, especially those that have inflated egos, that no matter what happens, it's never their fault. they should never feel bad about it, because after all, it was somebody else. You know, they go through this whole, and you've met people like that. And this is kind of the way this guy was. He didn't really ever take any responsibility when things went wrong. Now, when things went right and the coffers were full, you know, and all of that, yeah, he was showing everybody, look what I've done, you know. But we'll see a little bit later, when the coffers aren't so full, that we don't see him taking any, well, I you know, it was me. No, it doesn't happen. It was somebody else, always. All right. Evidently, sometime during this time, when he remembered Vashti and what had happened, he brought this to the attention of his servants. And, you know, these would be the guys who are with him all the time. You know, I think of it as a valet. You know, if you're a very rich guy, you have a valet who lays out your clothes, he helps you get dressed, he ties your shoes for you, you know, that kind of thing. These were those kinds of servants. I mean, they were with him all the time. They helped him get ready for bed, you know, they did all of that, made his bed. So probably in the course of the day, he mentioned to him, boy, you know, I don't know, but I remember Vashti, and I put out that degree. I said, now I don't know what to do about it. You know, what do I do now, you know? And he could say that to these guys because they knew him better than anybody. And so they got together and came up with a plan. And that plan was for officers of the court to be appointed in all 127 provinces to identify and gather all the beautiful young virgins from throughout the empire. Now, you know, when we first look at this, we kind of think about Cinderella maybe or something, you know, the story, Cinderella. But anyway, when you stop and think about 127 provinces, all the way from India clear down to Ethiopia, all of that land, how many beautiful young virgins would be there? And then, you know, you appoint 127 officials to go out into their province, and of course they're going to appoint other people to go out too, because one guy is not going to cover the whole province. So they've got to go out and gather all these women. How many women would that be? And you have to think about it, who is going to determine what is beautiful?
Yes.
What's beautiful to me may not be beautiful to somebody else. You know? So you know, this is really, you know, just on the surface it kind of makes sense until you start really looking at this thing. What in the world are you going to end up with? And how many are you going to end up with, and how much is it going to cost?
Oh.
And how long is it going to take? You know, all of a sudden you start looking at it. And what's the age? What are we looking at? Anything above 15?
Oh, jeez.
Anything above 20? You know, what's the age that they want? There is nothing here that's recorded that gives us any information about that. So, but being the man that he was, and with his disposition, Azariah said, okay, yeah, that's a great idea. So let's go out and do it. Also, there's nothing mentioned about compensation for the fathers. We look at this and we just think about him bringing in virgins, looking at him, deciding which ones he wants and sending them home. These women were not going to return home. They would be in the harem of the king. And by almost every nation's laws, including Persian, if you took a wife, you were expected to compensate the father. And so a Persian law would decree that there had to be a price paid for each of these girls. Now, none of that we see in here, but knowing Persian law, that would have to be done or he would be in violation of the law. And there was one thing about Azariah, most of the time he was very diligent about the Persian law. Remember, even with Vashti, he said, what does Persian law say? And when there wasn't any law really to cover the situation, he made up his own. You know, but if there was a law, he seemed to obey most of the time, and abide by that law. Okay, now here was the deal. After the officials got all these women together, that official had to escort those women into the women's quarter at the citadel at Shushan.
Must have been huge.
And there they would be cared for by Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of all the king's wives and concubines. So when this official brought them to the citadel, they became the property of King Ahasuerus. So they were his property. Now they were set aside, and they were given special beauty preparations, things, baths and all of the perfumes and all of the, maybe they even had the purple stuff to put in their hair, I don't know. All of this stuff was given, you have to have been here earlier to catch that one. But all these preparations were given to them so they could be prepared to meet the king. Now let's read verse 5. And in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shami, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadash, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. Now, we find some interesting things out here. Number one, Mordecai was living in the citadel. He was not in the adjacent town. He wasn't someplace else. He was living in the citadel. And his grandfather had been taken captive under Nebuchadnezzar. Now we can assume a few things here. If his grandfather was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, there's a pretty good chance that he was like Daniel, a wise man, an official probably in Judah, and somebody who was respected and maybe quite wealthy. Now there's also, we have to understand, there was three captivities by Babylon. The first was when Daniel was carried away in the third year of Jehoiakim in 605 BC. Now, this is, if you read the book of Daniel, for instance, some of the others, this is where Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as capturing or taking away these men. So if it's referred to as he was captured by Nebuchadnezzar, there's a very good chance that it was in this first captivity, which would have been the wisest men, the best, the most choice. And these were the ones Nebuchadnezzar put into places of authority. The second was when King Jeconiah was taken in 597 BC. So normally we would say it was the first one for Kish, but now we find out that it was under King Jeconiah when he was taken. That was also, however, the taking of the best that were left. So you had the first wave that Nebuchadnezzar took. Then with Jeconiah, you had the next level of officers. So if he went with Jeconiah, who was the king of Judah at that time, then it's pretty fair to say he was a member of the court in some degree under Nebuchadnezzar. He may have been a mayor, he may have been, put in that level. He wouldn't have been a governor, or he wouldn't have been in the government of Nebuchadnezzar at his palace, but he was under there somewhere in one of those other official capacities. So that gives us a little inkling as to the pedigree of Mordecai. And by the way, the last one was when Zedekiah was taken and Jerusalem was burned in 586 BC. And that's basically where they took anybody who could work, can you move? You're going to Babylon, and put them to work and scattered them throughout the Babylonian Empire. Now, Mordecai had a cousin. Her name was Hadash. And she was a girl that was orphaned sometime during the captivity. So Mordecai, and I didn't want to get into this tonight, but we have the Jewish idea that if your brother's wife, if your brother dies, you have to marry his wife. It's the right of redemption or the redeemer. Well, that was also would have applied here, because perhaps Mordecai was the closest relative to Hadash, and so therefore he would take her responsibility on as part of redeeming kinsmen. Now, whether that was actually applied here or whether he just did it because he wanted to, we're not told. But it seems like, and by the way, she was probably quite a bit younger than him. They say, and nobody knows because there isn't really any history that we can rely on, but the inference is he was probably somewhere around 20 years older than she was. So if her parents died when she was 5, he would have been 25 and took her in. We also don't know if Mordecai was married. That was probably the case, however, because it would be very difficult for a single man in those days especially to raise a child. They didn't have daycares and all of those sort of things. So it's quite possible and probable, in fact, that Mordecai was in fact married. Doesn't say so anywhere, just probably so. The word Hadash is Hebrew word meaning myrtle. So Hadash was evidently several years, as I mentioned, younger than Mordecai. And there's no indication that Mordecai officially adopted her, but he probably just took her in and raised her. Now, Hadash was young, lovely, and beautiful. Now, the combination of the words here indicate that she was not only beautiful, but she is what you would call stunning. There are a lot of beautiful women in the world, but once in a while you see that one woman who is stunning. I mean, you can't take your eyes off of her. I don't care whether you're male, female, who you are. You're just attracted to her because there's something about her. She's stunning. I don't know, maybe you know the same as I do, but I think Melanie, is that her name? Trump.
Melania?
Yeah, would be in that classification. I mean, she just exudes beauty and grace and all of those things. And you just look, I said, whoa,
Beautiful.
And that's the way that Hadash, or Esther, was. She wasn't just the run-of-the-mill, average, beautiful girl. She was stunning. All right. So let's go down now to verse 8. Hey, we're making not too bad time here. Verse 8. So when the king's command and decree was heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. All right. So, when the official went out to gather the young women from the citadel, because it was included, he came across Hadash. And the Targum, now I'm going to throw this term out too, Targum. Targum is a Hebrew word that means it's an oral translation of either the law or something to do with the law. And it was not written. And this would be used, of course, where you had people who were illiterate or the Hebrew wasn't spoken there. They would use a Targum. And that was merely somebody's oral interpretation of the works. And so there is a Targum, which was an oral interpretation of the writings of this period. And it talks about Mordecai. And it says, when the official came to Mordecai to get Hadash, that he hid her away, so they couldn't find him, or find her. And he was refusing to turn her over to the official. And there's an interesting statement in there that the only thing that caused him to release her to be taken to the king's harem was when the king's authority was involved. So in other words, he was hiding her on the excuse that this wasn't the king doing this was this official who was, But it wasn't until the official produced the decree, signed and signified by the ring of the king, that Mordecai stepped back and allowed them to take Hadash. Now, of course, this is, again, a Targum. And Targums were generally not too reliable because they often were embellished, sometimes just to embellish them, and other times just so people would better understand, what was going on. So how much of that is true, we don't know. But the story is interesting to me because it points out something about Mordecai. And that is, even though he was a devout Jew living in a foreign country, that he recognized the rightful authority of that country and abided by the rightful authority of that country. And I'm using that term rightful authority, and we'll see later on as we get into the story why I think that is important to really understand in this context of the book of Esther. All right. So, Mordecai warned Hadash and that she was not to let anybody know that she was a Jew. Now, again, we have to kind of look at Babylonian customs, but typically they accepted all nations that were in their providences, and we'll see that as we go through again and understand who Mordecai was, understand who Haman was. It didn't really matter a lot, your nationality. It was how devoted you were to the king and your abilities and skills at being whatever the job was you were doing. And so there really wasn't a lot of racism or anything like that in Babylon. However, the Jews were considered second-class citizens because they were not Persian. And this would be a normal situation in any society. That doesn't mean that we treat them badly or anything like that. It just means that, in people's minds, we just kind of automatically, we have, I'm trying to think of the word, but we just kind of automatically say this person isn't really a real whatever it is. Now here in the U.S. we haven't really. There are some people that do, yes, but as a whole, that's why we're called a melting pot, because we really can't say I'm Irish and therefore everybody who's not Irish is a second-class citizen. Can't say that. I can't say, or I'm German and everybody who's not German is second-class citizen. No, because we are a melting pot and we have brought everybody together and melted them together. Now there are individuals, and I'm not, I understand that. I'm not going to get into that arena. But I'm just saying as a nation, this is our stated goals and this is what we should be doing. Babylon, while it was not a melting pot in that sense, it had a very high tolerance, I think I'll use the word tolerance, for other nationalities, and so used them wherever. Daniel is a great example under Nebuchadnezzar. He was not a second-class citizen in terms of his abilities or what he was. He was sent all over the country as the top official from Babylon. I mean, when you read his history of him, he traveled to all of the national capitals, India, and all of these places, personal representative of Nebuchadnezzar. And yet when they caught him praying, it was to his God. His God, that second-class kind of thing. And so I'm going into all this, so hopefully you'll understand that what Mordecai did not want to happen is that when Esther got inside, all of a sudden they found out she was a Jew, and now she's treated in the harem as a second-class citizen. Because I don't have to say how mean women can be sometimes.
Amen.
Yes. So anyway, that's why he did not want that. Some have said it was because he wanted to make sure she made queen. And from the actions of Mordecai, I don't think he was anticipating her ever being queen. That she would be in the harem of the king. And in that harem, that she could be safe and well taken care of. So that's kind of my take anyway on what was going on there. Now, we don't have any indication other than her beauty about Esther, but I think from the story here that she found favor in the eyes of Haggai. I think that speaks as much to her personality, to her demeanor, as it does to her beauty. Because you can have very beautiful women and very handsome men, and then when you get to meet them or you get to be around them, you find out what they're really like. And all of a sudden the beauty fades and the handsomeness fade away, and what you see is somebody you'd like to just set in the middle of the floor on a tee and put them through the uprights, just boot them right out. And I've met, in my years doing security work and with stars and celebrities, I've met my share of both. And I'll tell you, there's some of them. Anyway, so I think this says something to not only her beauty, but that inner beauty that she had. There was just that personality. There was just that spiritual something that came out of her that people just liked her. Just liked her. All right. Now also, there is the possibility, and a lot of writers suggest this, that she found favor in the eyes of Haggai because he assumed or felt that she would be the one to be selected by the king, because she was the closest to what the king would want. And there's probably a lot of truth to that, because he was the head of the harem. He certainly knew which of the women that Ahasuerus liked, which ones he called on the most, which ones he wanted to be around the most, which ones he was most comfortable with. And so, using that as a measuring stick, he quite possibly felt that Esther was going to be the one. Now, we don't know. We don't know, but we just know she found favor in his eyes. And so he gave her extra preparations. He gave her more cosmetics than he gave the others, or more costly perfumes, as well as her daily allotment of food, the things that she needed. Now, she was also given 7 maidservants to prepare her to meet the king. Now, a lot of the writers, historical writers, point out that probably all of the maidens that came in, all the virgins, were given 7 servants to serve them, to get them ready. But Esther was given the 7 with the most skill, because it specifically says he came from the house of Ahasuerus, the king. Very possibly, these were the ones that would attend the queen, or had attended Vashti, the queen. So these were the best. You know, you all have your hairdresser that's the best. Well, that's these. One of them would be the hairdresser, or 2 of them. You know, one of them would be the makeup expert, one would be the expert at dress, and then of course they had to teach her all the decorum of the court. And I'm sure they put a scroll on her head and had her walk across the floor, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, we think about her taking a bath for 6 months, but no, you know, she had to be taught all of these things. Somebody had to teach her how to talk correctly. So there was a speech therapist there to make sure you elicit your words correctly and that you use the correct language and the right words. So all of this had to be done for each of these young ladies. All right. Now it's also interesting to note here that Esther was moved to the best lodging in the harem. Now this can mean several things, and we're going to go into the different types of houses that were in the citadel. This could mean that she was placed in the queen's quarters, former queen's quarters, which at this time would be vacant because Vashti was no longer queen. And she wasn't thrown out, by the way. She would be living with the other wives as a common wife. And we'll talk about that all in a minute.
She was upset.
But anyway, she was given at least the best room in the house, if not the special room for the queen. Now, Esther had not told anyone that she was a Hebrew. And of course, as I pointed out, she would be perhaps treated as inferior and not treated well. It's kind of funny to me, it's kind of humorous, that the whole time that Esther was in preparation, Mordecai was out pacing in front of the women's quarters. I mean, this is, you know, you see somebody about to have a baby, you know, and the guy's out there pacing up and down. But pacing up and down for his niece, actually, or cousin, I mean, even though he raised her, it just seems kind of humorous to me. Here's Mordecai out there. But this, I think, points something out, another thing about Mordecai. Now, a lot of the writers say that they think Mordecai was a porter, somebody who carried the bags of the dignitaries when they came into the castle, because he stayed at the gate, or sat in the gate. However, knowing the disposition in those days and the laws in those days, what would they have done if they found a porter pacing in front of the women's quarters? Knowing that the women were completely separated and were not to be viewed by other men. You know, I don't think it takes much imagination to figure out what would have happened to him. You know, you go, whoosh, that was the end of this one. No more peeping Toms. We got rid of them. Yeah. So how could he be there? Well, to me, a very logical answer, and one that is supported by other historians, is that in fact Mordecai was an official in the citadel. And the fact that he sat in the gate, now a little understanding about the gates, Persian gates, and you know we were there in Israel, and the gates there, they had rooms kind of on each side, and this is where you conducted your business, was considered in the gate. It was on the inside of the gate, but it was in this area that was considered in the gate. And in there you did your business. Of course, we know from Scripture that that's where the judges sat, and if you had a dispute, you would go to the judge, and that's where his courtroom was, in the gate. Well, Persians had the same kind of a setup, although they also had, in this case, because it was the royal palace, and they have unearthed a lot of these in the palaces of that time, where they would have a row of seats, at one side or both sides. And so if you came to see the king, you sat down on that seat, and then one of the doorkeepers to the royal throne room would come out and get you and escort you into the presence of the king, or the ruler. Could be a queen. So it was actually a waiting room to go see the king. Now, if you were a high official in the Persian Empire, and you needed to go before the king on a regular basis, you couldn't just walk in there. And we think, you know, about how terrible this was, you know. But when you stop and think about it, if you wanted to go see the president of the company that you work for, or that somebody works for, you don't just walk in. No, you walk, they say, have a seat, and you sit down, and when it's time, the secretary or the administrator or somebody will open the door and usher you into the presence of whoever it is you're seeing. So it's no different than what we do today. The point here is that Mordecai was in the gate all the time because he was an official that was waiting to go see the king all the time. This would also explain that since he was an official, nobody cared if he walked up and down in front of the women's quarters. Is that going to cause any great consternation? This guy's an official. And after he saw the king, he would have plenty of time to walk up and down in front of the women's quarters. You see? So it starts to make more sense that he was in fact an official. And then when you add to it the concept of Kish being an official in Nebuchadnezzar's court, these things tended to be handed down, you know, from father to son. So very probably he was some kind of an official that had to regularly see the king. All right. Back down here. Also, even to get to the gates of the women's quarters, you would have had to have been somebody of some importance just to get that far into the palace, because it was at the far end of the palace. So you would have had to have gone in and go as long as the palace was to get back to the women's quarters. So again, I just kind of adds a little more to that. All right. Verse 12. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations of the women, for thus were the days of their preparation appointed. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgis, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. All right, so each woman was required to spend 12 months in preparation. That was before they could go into Ahasuerus. 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes. Now myrrh was highly esteemed both for its scent and for the purifying powers. It was useful in making the skin exactly clean. In other words, when you had 6 months of myrrh, there was nothing in your skin. I mean, it was perfectly clean. It had to be when that myrrh got through with you. It also made the skin very tight and you know, took away this, you know. I need to get some myrrh, stop taking a bath and myrrh. You know, it took all this stuff goes away. It tightened everything up, took away all the wrinkles, made your skin all look so nice and shiny.
We still have the chance.
All right, and also it also gave the skin strength, and it gave rigor to the body, to the whole body. So you really became athletic, more athletic looking. Then of course the Egyptians, they used it for embalming. It was one of the spices, the things that they used when they embalmed the mummies, because it kept your skin tight and it kept it from molding, decaying, you know, rotting. It had all of those. So if you used a lot of embalming, you never had to worry about walking around and have your arm fall off from rot. You know, you were really in good shape there. All right. Now the Hebrews used it to reduce the odors of decay in the family tomb. They didn't embalm, but they used the myrrh to cut down the odors that would emit from decaying flesh. Because you remember, Hebrew tradition, they had family tombs. So you would put them in the tomb, and then you may have to open that tomb up again in 6 months to put somebody else in. And you know, so and that was the part of the reasoning for that, is to cut down that odor of decaying flesh. Now the perfumes and other preparations, it doesn't take long, very much to figure really this one out. They didn't have deodorant. So is that enough said? When you're in a country as hot and humid as it is in that part of the country, I mean, it's consistently over 105, 110 in the summer, very, very hot, and you don't have deodorants and you don't have the things we have today, so they would pile on the perfumes, and it was a way of masking body odor. And I guess 6 months of putting that on, and pretty soon you didn't have to put it on so much. I guess probably your body starts shoving the perfume out you've been putting in it for 6 months. I don't know however that works. All right, so after each woman was fully prepared, she was ready to go in to see the king, and she was given everything that she wanted. So she could go through all the dresses, all the ornaments, all the everything, and pick out just what she felt would make her the most acceptable to the king. Now, you have to understand, this was a contest. This was a contest. Who is going to be made queen? And so every woman was very much interested in being queen, of course. King, did I say king? I probably did, being queen. Was very much interested in being queen. So she would go through all of this, and then she would pick out, you know, the dress that would accent her figure the best, or show the most. And the jewelry and anklets and bracelets and all of the stuff that was available. Whatever she wanted. If she wanted enough gold that she would take her to her knees to get through the door, she could get it. She'd have whatever she wanted. All right, so when she got everything that she wanted, she went in for the express purpose of spending the night with Ahasuerus. Make no mistake, this was not a beauty contest in which the king sat out in a chair and they paraded in front of her and he decided what he wanted. No, she went to bed with him. And they spent the night together. And in the morning, she went back to the second house in the harem. Now this is important, and this accentuates what I just said. There were three major houses that were in a Persian ruler's citadel, or probably almost any ruler from any of the empires in those days. Now the first house was built for the wives and their attendants. Wives were those who were legally married to the king, and he could have as many wives as he wanted. You look at poor Solomon, it's no wonder that guy almost lost his mind. I forget how many wives he had. Then that was the first house. The second house was the king's concubines. These were women, we use the term very loosely, prostitutes. Really, that was not what they were. They were used like that, I suppose. You could think of it in those terms. But these were women, for one reason or another, who either could not be married or just weren't married to the king. And they were treated like wives. They were given almost everything the wives were given. They lived in the harem and were well taken care of. The third house, this was the house of the virgins, and this is where they would bring the virgins and the young women, and they would take care of them, just as we're reading about here. They were in there for the express purpose of being prepared to meet the king. Now, also, it seems, and history kind of points out, that there was also, at times, a second group of virgins who were brought in, and these were trained explicitly to be entertainers, dancers, you know, those kinds of things. They never actually went into the king, but he would see the king because they would come in and dance at the feasts and the banquets and those kinds of things. So there seemed to be kind of two levels of these virgins that were brought in. Some stayed there, some went in to see the king. Now, when they went into the king, they came out, they were no longer virgins. So they went into the second house, which was the house of the concubines, because they were not as yet married to the king. So does that I hope that kind of clarifies how this hierarchy of women in the court, how that kind of worked. Now, the only women who could ever go back to see the king were only those who delighted him and who he called by name. These were the concubines. If he decided he wanted to marry one of them, the whole ball game changed. They moved into the first house of the wives, and then it wasn't a matter of being called, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. All of them who he did not delight in, or who he did not call by name, these stayed concubines. Now it's interesting, some of these women may be concubines the rest of their life and never go into the king again. They just live in the harem. And that really wasn't such a bad thing, because there is I don't know if I have it on here. I don't think I have it on there. But there is some interesting archaeological stuff that these women, all the women, the primary function of the harem, by the way, was for the king to have children. That was really the primary function. So if they had 150 kids, that was great. That was great. And you know, we'd say, you know, yeah, wait a minute. But they had all the servants, they had everybody take care of them, the women, all of them. So, you know, that would not be a difficult situation. And the more offspring, the monarch was looked at as being more powerful and greater the more children he had. So it was one of the ways in which they were graded, I guess you could say. Now, in Persian life, each notable man had a harem for the sake of having children, and all the women in the harem were educated. Some learned skills such as horsemanship, archery, and some went on hunts. They traveled with their husband and attended feasts and banquets with him, but left when the female entertainers from the harem came in and the men started merrymaking. So we see that, you know, in the harem life was not like they show in the movies, exactly. They had everything they wanted. They live in really opulence, beautiful quarters, and they had everything they wanted. And they were educated. I mean, they were well taken care of. And many of them, like I said, never saw the king again except at a banquet. So they just lived a very secluded life, but it was a very good life. And, you know, when you step back and look at the times and the way people lived, I think about, we were at Israel and we saw the shepherds out there, and, you know, they're out there in these tents, and they're really shabby looking, some of them, and, you know, that's the way they're living. How many of them would take the opportunity to move into a harem? You know, you really have to look at it from that perspective. We give the harems, and the kings a bad rap because of their harems, but in a lot of ways, it really improved the lifestyle of some of these women. And they were also looked at by those outside of the citadel as women who were very privileged. So they moved up in stature within their communities. And of course, understand, in order to get there, they had to walk with the scroll across the floor. So, you know, these people were well trained, and they were just that step above most of the other people in etiquette and all of those things. Now, there was one who was called the chief consort, the wife, who as a rule was the daughter of a Persian prince. If you remember last week, the suggestion last week, from one of the wise men about getting rid of Vashti with the assumption the next one would move up, here we go, was the daughter of a Persian prince and the mother of the heir to the throne. Controlled the house. She controlled the household. The traditional title of Mana Posani, mistress, which means mistress of the house, I'll get by all of this, must have been borne by the queen consort, if not by the mother of the reigning monarch, on whose positions, more stuff. Anyway, these ladies were subject only to the king. Each had their own living quarter, her own revenue and estates, and a large number of servants, which included harem eunuchs and concubines. Now, the reason I'm reading this is what they were in the contest about. If they could be the queen, they had their own income, their own servant, their own quarters, everything. They controlled the household. Now, we hear about the eunuchs and all the officials that took care of the king's business. They didn't take care of the household. That was the queen or the consort wife or chief wife. She took care of the household. That's the kids, anything to do with the kids, how they were dressed, where they went, blah, blah, blah. That was hers. And that's what they were vying for, was to be in this position. All right. Gotta hurry. Verse 15. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her daughter to go to the queen, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to Queen Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. And thus was born Purim, the Hebrew feast of Purim, and that's what this is all about, Esther. And of course the salvation of the Jews. Now, a couple things quickly notice here. Number one, Esther evidently had a great deal of wisdom, and she decided that the best thing to do was let Haggai decide what the king liked. You know, all these women were putting on all of this stuff, and they had no idea what Ahasuerus might like or might not like. He may not like all of that jewelry and all of that stuff. And so whatever Haggai said, she said, dress me however you want. Give me whatever you think will impress the king. Now there's two thoughts here. One of them is she was relying on Haggai to give her the best advice, and the other one is she really didn't care. Either one of those can very well fit into the narrative of this story. And when I say didn't care, she didn't really want to go into the harem in the first place. And, you know, she may have just said, well, whatever. If he wants me, he wants me. And if he doesn't, he doesn't. You know, no big deal. And that might fit her personality, too. Because she had that kind of personality that says, whatever comes, I'm ready. Let's go. So anyway, after being dressed and adorned by Haggai, notice this, everyone who saw her could not help but be impressed and admired. I left the not out of there in your notes. Not only was she beautiful, her dress, all of her accents, everything she wore accentuated her beauty. Now she was taken in the 10th month of Tebeth, or in January, in our time frame, in our calendar, in the 7th year of the reign of Ahasuerus. Now, we know from our previous lesson, Ahasuerus threw the feast in the 3rd year of his reign. So this is 4 years after the feast, the 6-month feast. Okay. Now, that seems like it took a long time, but when you stop and think, number one, Ahasuerus was gone for 2 years doing battle with the Greeks. Secondly, it took a year for the women to get ready. And that's assuming all the women were done at the same time. Now when you think about it, how long did it take to go into the king? There's 365 days in the year. It's very doubtful that the king went into a new virgin every night. That's very doubtful. Because part of the time, I'm sure he was gone, other business, other things going on. He also had his wives that, you know, and we'll find out in a minute, they were on a schedule. So there were a lot of things. There were a lot of things that I'm serious. That's what the note says. They were on a schedule. Anyway, there were a lot of things going on. So you can see that 4 years is absolutely not beyond reason for the length of time. And it was probably 2 years that he went through, that it took him to get through all of these young women. 177 provinces if they just brought one each. If they brought 2 each, how about if they brought 10 each? All of a sudden, you're looking at 1,100 women to go through. You see, you're starting to see what I'm talking about. You know, it would have taken a while. So anyway, you only had 365 days to get this done a year. All right, so.
I wonder how old he was.
It took a year for all this to happen anyway. So since there, well, it does not,
I mean,
it also does not say that Esther was the last one. Assumed that she was somewhere in the middle, maybe toward the end, maybe toward the front. But he probably went through all of those young women before he made his selection. Because that was his law. I mean, that was what he said he was going to do. So, you know, he had to obey himself. I guess, that way. So this kind of gives you an idea of what all was happening. Now, we don't know how long Esther stayed in the second house. But it probably wasn't very long after he had finished going through all of the young ladies that he decided what he wanted. And she was taken out and made queen. All right. It says here, he loved Esther above all the others. And this word that's used here indicates a deep felt love and not just a sensual appeal. You know, there's a lot of definitions for love, the English word love. But in the Assyrian or Persian sense, what was meant here was he fell in love with Esther. It was not just, oh, I'm so in love. Ooh. There was really a heartfelt desire for Esther. And of course, looking back on the story, we can say, well, this is something that came directly from God as a way of deliverance for the Jewish people. So he loved her better than the others. He showed grace and favor on her, and he put the royal crown on her head, making her Vashti's replacement as queen of Persia. And by the way, the crown was not one of these big crowns. It was just a single band went around the head, and on the front they usually had like a little triangle thing with stones in it, precious stones, and maybe some gems around the side. They didn't go into the big heavy crowns, and in fact the king of Persia only had a very similar type crown. We'd call it more like a tiara than a full crown. Persians didn't go much for that. All right, verse 19. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the chronicles in the presence of the king. Now, this obviously happened sometime after Esther was crowned queen. And for some reason, there was another group of virgins that were brought into the citadel. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they were brought in for the same reason. These could have been brought in to be trained as entertainers. There could have been any reason why they were brought in. All we know is this was a way of fixing the time of the event in that particular era. It's when the second group of virgins were brought in, whenever that was. Now, it seems that Mordecai was probably sitting on a seat waiting to go in to see the king. And he, of course, being there all the time, knew all the servants, knew all the eunuchs. Now these eunuchs were probably, and we don't know for certain because there's so many things they could have been, but in the context of what we're seeing, it seems that these were probably the door to the king, to where the king was. They couldn't lay hold of the king unless they had access to the king. So it's pretty obvious that they had access. Some say, well, these were the ones who were his chamberlains, you know, who got him ready for bed and whatever. If that's the case, what are they doing in front of the door, you know, doing something in the gate? That doesn't fit. They'd be up in the quarters, taking care of the king's quarters. That's where they'd be. So these two guys were probably the ones that opened the doors and, you know, okay, Mordecai, you can come in, you know, that kind of thing. They were ushering people in to see the king. And it came to Mordecai's attention. Now, it's interesting to note here, based on what we'll see later in the story, that he told Esther, and Esther turned around and told the king. Now, we have this impression that Esther could not go into the king unless he called for her. So how did she go into the king? Well, I think the answer is really more obvious. She was the queen. If she had a request or business, you know, royal business, she would have to be called. Just like Mordecai had to be called. In other words, she would put her name on the list like everybody else, and when it came your time, you walked in to see the king. Okay? However, when it was just family business, it seems that she had access to the king. You know, she is in charge of the household. So it stands to reason that if it's that kind of a thing, and it's more of a family or thing that she would be in with the king. All right? Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Otherwise, it'd be very, very difficult to carry on any kind of a relationship with your kids or your wife, your queen, anything, you know, if you didn't have that kind of, at least some access. So it appears that probably she was in there on some family business or just being with the king. That's the thing. I'm sure there were a lot more concubines that never saw the king again after she became queen, simply because of who she was. So she no doubt was spending more time with the king. And it was on one of those occasions that she says, I just heard from a man named Mordecai. He's one of your officials out at the gate, by the way. And he overheard that two of your eunuchs, these two guys, are planning to kill you. And so, of course, Ahasuerus, he went out and had an investigation. He called out the CSI team, and they went out there. No, CIS team, yes, criminal, yes. And they went out and did their investigation and come back and said, sure enough, these guys had been heard making these comments and making these plans, and so they built the gallows and hung both of them. You see, in those days, they didn't have the rights of regress. There wasn't the 6-month waiting period. They just built them and hung them. All right. Now we're going to move into the next portion of this. So we've gone through the crowning of Esther, you know, the opening story about the feasts and all of that, and how through this whole period of time, Esther now is queen, and Mordecai is still in his position. And this is interesting also. Generally, when somebody was named queen, all of their relatives were automatically elevated to great positions, you know. But she never told the king, and so he was never elevated beyond where he was. He was still the official waiting in the gate. All right, now let's move chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat among all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gates bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman, to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. In the first month, which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month, until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Okay, now this was possibly in the year 476 to 405 BC. That Haman was promoted to this position as being second highest in the kingdom. This kind of brings back, the story of Joseph, second highest in Egypt. Moses was raised to be the next Pharaoh. So we see these Jews in different situations, different time frames when they have been promoted. Well, this was not a Jew. And this guy, unlike the others, did not really deserve the offer. And we'll see that he was quite a character. So little is known about him, or why he was promoted. Now his name seems to mean given to the moon. Given to the moon. Now, they had strange names in those days. They have strange names today. But anyway, so the meaning of Agatite, which was his father, is unknown, but was probably a town that no longer exists. It is also associated with King Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites. So there's a very good possibility that there's an association there. Now the king commanded that whenever Haman passed, that all the servants were to bow down as a sign of honor. Now this extreme showing of respect had evidently not been claimed by the former viziers. Now viziers would be the, today in the United States, that would be chief of staff. That would be the guy closest to the king. And so the other viziers had evidently not had this homage being paid to them of bowing down. Now, since the king had decreed that this prostration to be observed whenever Haman passed by, this had to happen, and it showed the place that Ahasuerus had given to Haman. Now it seems that Mordecai was the only one who refused to bow down. Now we don't know for sure, it's not made clear, but very possibly and quite probably, being a Jew, and no doubt a devout Jew, that he refused to bow to any man, because that was prohibited in the law. So he put the law of God above the law of Ahasuerus. Also, there was the idea, I think, that he had probably been in the court as long or maybe even longer than Haman, and he had seen the other viziers, and he did not feel this man deserved the homage, because he was not a good man. He was an evil man, and we'll see some of that as we go through the story. All right. So Mordecai is out in the gate, and every day he's being asked, why aren't you bowing down? They pressured him day after day. Finally he said, because I'm a Jew. Now, there had to be some extreme pressure there, because he was so careful to keep the fact that he was Jewish and Esther was Jewish, to keep that back. So there had to have been a lot of pressure on him before he finally said, well, I'm a Jew. That automatically made Esther a Jew also. However, it doesn't seem anybody made the connection, let alone Haman. All right, so Haman was told, and he was filled with wrath, and he formulated a plan to destroy all the Jews who lived in the kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now it says he didn't move against Mordecai right then because of his people, the people of Mordecai. History tells us that there was a very large Jewish contingent in Shushan. Perhaps many of the officials were Jewish. Even though they may not admit it, they were Jewish. And to come against Mordecai probably would have crippled the government at that point and, could have backfired. So this is a little bit of back take on some of that. Now, there is some thought, based on his father's name being Agagite, that Haman was in fact a Amalekite. And of course, we went through Judges, and the Amalekites were the sworn enemies of the Jews. So here you have Haman, who is an Amalekite, in this high position in government. You have one man who is a Jew who is refusing to bow down. So Haman devised a plan. Not only would he do away with Mordecai, who is giving him a personal affront by not bowing, he'll just get rid of all the Jews and be a national hero to the Amalekites. You see, now it starts to, yeah. Now, this was not be unheard of. 50 years before that, Darius, who was the father of Ahasuerus, he wiped out a whole group called the Magi. And I forget how many thousands they were. It was genocide. They just came in and wiped them out. And you remember when Jesus was born, Herod, he was going to just wipe out all the young boys. Pharaoh, he took care of all the babies in Egypt. So this was not something that was unusual. This was just a way of solving a problem. So, but there were some problems. It would take a great deal of planning and a great deal of time. Number one, you had to locate and identify all the Jews. You got 127 provinces all the way from India to Ethiopia. How are you going to define and identify the Jews? So that had to be done. They had to assemble the necessary men to carry it out, and then they had to determine how to carry it out. How are you going to kill this many people? And then, of course, there were the side issues. If you kill all these Jews, how are you going to fill in all of the positions that would be open? And what are you going to do with the dead bodies when you get through? Because you're talking about a lot of Jews. So all of this required planning. Now it's interesting that that Haman, his idea was to cast lots. And in those days, casting of lots, as throwing dice or drawing straws or whatever they used, would indicate divine providence. In other words, their gods were saying this was the way to do it, through the lot. And so, and by the way, the high priest with the and thum was a very similar thing. It was rocks or stones that were rolled and the answer would come up. But God ordained that one. These were all counterfeits. So anyway, he did, and the date that came up was the last month of the year, which would have been 12 months in the future, and the 13th day. So they rolled for first for the month, and then for the day. And it was the 12th, the 12th month on the 13th day of the month. All right. Now, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people, in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Notice that. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. So when Haman brought this to the king agreed on it. Notice though the basic fact is true. Mordecai did not follow the law. But notice Haman exaggerated and said they don't follow the king's laws, plural. They have their own laws, plural. And the assumption being that these people are going to spread dissent throughout the provinces, and your laws will no longer be in effect if these people are allowed to stay, even though it was one man defying one law. So that's what I say about Haman. Haman was not a good person. Haman was very evil. And we'll go on to see just how evil this guy could actually be. I use the excuse that it would not be fit or profitable for the king to allow these people to stay in the kingdom. In other words, it's going to cost you. They're not of any profit to you. Haman suggested, of course, that Ahasuerus issue this decree and that all of the Jews should be killed on one day in the province. And this is what's interesting. He said, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver. Now, 10,000 talents of silver is between 1.5 and $3 billion in today's currency. So you say Haman must have really been wealthy, right?
Yeah.
Well, you have to understand what was going on behind all of this. Now, he was a very wealthy man. However, his plan, and notice Ahasuerus said, the people and everything they have is all yours. What he was saying was, we'll kill all the Jews. I'll get all of the money and possessions and boot and looty. It's all mine. And then I will give to the treasury 10,000 talents. So he was expecting to get in excess of $3 billion from all of the Jews that were killed. Now does it start to make a little sense? Here's an Amalekite who every year came through and tried to steal everything from the Israelites, and we learned that from Judges. You know, they were the ones that came down and they were involved with the Midianites. It was the Midianites and the Amalekites, if you remember, the hundreds of thousands that came through. And here he is, now he's going to do the same thing all by himself, basically. He's going to have his soldiers out there doing the killing, but now he's going to reap everything of these Jews, continuing what the Amalekites had been doing for hundreds of years, just in a different venue. Isn't that interesting? How the scriptures evolve and cycle through some of the same things from different views, and we find out that men never change. Now, this was especially appealing to Ahasuerus because, according to history, the cost of the failed invasion of Greece bankrupted Persia. Bankrupted Persia. Their coffers were almost empty. And here comes a windfall. $3 billion in my treasury. And I don't have to do anything. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. You talk about timing. You know, everything was just right on time. God, he just never misses. Never misses. He's neither too early nor too late for anything. He's always right on time. Notice that Ahasuerus gave the signet ring to Haman to be used in authorizing the decree, and it authorized him to keep all the wealth, and he was, no doubt, it doesn't say he loaned it to him, it said gave it to him. And when a king gave someone their signet ring, they gave them all the authority of the kingdom. So Haman had that. All right. Finally, verses 12 to 15. Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every man in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published to all people, and they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. All right. So on the 13th day of the first month, now evidently, probably this was part of Haman's plan, since his lot had said to be on the 13th day of the last month, or 12th month. So on the same day he issued the decree. That gave them exactly 1 month, or 1 year, to get ready. Get ready. All right. The Jews had 1 year to get ready to be annihilated. Now they had some. I look at this on two sides. One of them, of course, they had the choice of being annihilated. The other one, could have also been considered one of God's ways of forcing the people to go back to Jerusalem where he wanted them. Because these were people who were voluntarily staying. They had been given their release. They could go back. But because of their prestige, because of their wealth, and Mordecai was probably one of those, official in the government. Now, if he was just a porter, by the way, I don't think he would have stuck around. He'd have been gone. So it was a way of prodding them to get back to Jerusalem, because they could escape and just go to Palestine and be with the other Jews in Palestine and been safe. Because as I said last week, this decree was only active in the 127th provinces under Persian rule. And Jerusalem was not part of that. Or Palestine was not part of that. So they would have been fine. It was also gave those in charge time to get their army together, decide how they're going to kill all these people, identify them, this kinds of things. So they had the time to do all of this. By the way, this is not unlike Nazi Germany. Long before the concentration camps were opened, the Nazi troops were going through the cities identifying Jews, putting that big thing on their shoulder. It said Jew. So they were identifying and marking all the Jews until the time came to round them all up, and then they rounded them up in cattle cars and put them in the concentration camps. And one of the most vivid memories I have of Latvia is standing in that forest with two big mounds where 20,000 Jews were killed in 2 days by the Nazis. It's just, I can't even explain the feeling that you get standing there. So it was not something that was unusual that was being done here, as far as getting ready for it, planning for it, getting it all together. The last thing to notice on here, that while the king and Haman were having a drink and congratulating themselves on this wonderful decree that was going to solve both their problems. The citadel was perplexed. They were in confusion. Because right outside the palace door was all of the Jews who lived in the citadel understood they were on the list. All right, questions? Little too tedious for you, or is this too much?